Hello, I'm Robert, and this is to fact check the story that we're going to run out of topsoil in 60 years. This is not true at all. Nobody actually knows where it came from originally. Our World in Data, they tried tracing it back. We know when it was first published, it was the New Scientist in 2013. But further back, it's just an unnamed senior official at the UN FAO farming conference, and it can't go any further back than that. Nobody knows what the reasoning was behind it, but it's clearly false. This shows the lifespan of soils around the world. If you look at conservation soil, and this does not mean organic farming, this just means soils where they do good soil management. And 21% of those are thickening. That's about a bit over 1 in 5 is getting thicker. And only 7% of conservation managed soils is going to has a lifespan of less than 100 years. Even when you go to the conventionally managed soils, then it's still, most of those by far have lifespans much greater than 100 years. Many have lifespans of thousands and tens of thousands of years. And the problem with these conventionally managed soils is that they keep taking the crops off the soil, but all they add in is fertilizer. They don't add organics back into the soil. So this is something that has to be changed. In the 2000s, so it was a real problem that they were highlighting, but it's not about the soil's gone in 60 years. What it did happen, it was in 2013, so it's a very ancient story now that keeps getting circulated around. A big follow-up report in 2015 really affirmed the importance of soil health. They found that at that time, 33% of the land was moderately to highly degraded from various causes. And so far it wasn't causing major problems, but if this continued, then it would severely damage food production and food security. And that was the start of the the Global Soil Partnership with the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is helping to turn this around. And one thing most of you don't realize is that many soils are actually thickening. So you might be quite surprised to hear that. And this shows what we could, it's a good example to look at some of the historical ones from the past, because it shows what we could do in the future if we turn this around really thoroughly. This shows the Viking dig in York, where I used to live in York. Indeed, I did a bit of voluntary work, things like wheelbarrowing on the Viking dig, and just scraping away at things, nothing very fancy. And I remember that the soil was very rich, organic soil, just like topsoil, but going down, as you see, about 4 meters down. Just rich topsoil. Most soils are only a foot deep, but some of the ancient soils where human beings used to live, they can be, in this case, several meters deep. Now, this was where people were actually living, so it had things like wood and bark and things that they brought in, clay to making the floors of their houses and so on, just built up and up and up. But lots of organics involved in it, like bark from tanning and ash, wood and things like that, dye bath waste, bone and so on. But if you look at the agricultural land, a lot of the agricultural land is very deep too. Starting in the 10th century, we started having very deep agricultural soil that goes to about 3-4 feet in depth. The idea that led to this deep soil, this is a very early version which goes back much further to about 1100 BC. This is not very far from where I live. This is the northern Harris. My sister lives, two of my sisters live on Skye, and these features are quite common on Skye, the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And what these are ridges. And the ancient people, they would dig up the turf and pile it up in these ridges. And this caused very thick soil along the ridges and then drainage between the ridges. Then in the 10th century AD, sometime around that, then people started digging up the turfs from the heaths like this and carting them down to sandy soil. And this is very common in some places. This happened in the Netherlands, for instance. 30% of the sandy soil, 30% of the soil in the Netherlands is sandy and is suitable for this practice. And a third of those have these very, very thick, deep, anthropogenic soils, these soils made by human beings, by carting turfs. And what they did is they dug up the turfs, they put them in their byres in the winter, so they all got mixed up with manure, and then they put those out in the fields in summer, and the fields just got thicker and thicker and thicker, till they got these very thick deposits of soil. And this soil is not actually incredibly fertilizer-like in fertilizer. It hasn't got lots of nutrients in it, but it is very dark, which is good for warming up early in the year, and very thick, which is great for avoiding problems with drought, which are both useful things still to this day. Now, many of you may not realize that in normal woods and pastures, this soil actually keeps rising. It isn't just static, it keeps rising up and up. And so there's constantly carbon dioxide, especially like the peat bogs, and they're going up and up with grassland too and forests. And this is a very striking example. This is my house, and this is a little stream that runs outside my house. And this was when it was built in 2012. And you can see the sheep there. You can see this that gravel, right? Now, I have not done. Someday I'm going to have a proper garden there. I just haven't done anything about it in the last 9 years. And you can see there's been no input there except rain, and then some droppings from the sheep, not very much, not huge amounts. They just sometimes go past my house. And leaves, some leaves fall in the gutter when I clean out the gutter of the house, and a few droughts end up on it's not much at all, not very much material. But there would be quite good nutrients in the actual rock itself. And apart from that, all that is needed for making organics is carbon dioxide, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. Those are the top elements that are used. And most of those, and all of those, can come out of the atmosphere. So this is just a few years later. And you can see grass already forming and little bushy things. And a little bush has started coming up, gorse bush. And all of that material, nearly all of that mass, comes out of the atmosphere. The carbon comes directly from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The water, some of it, well, it just comes down as rain there. It's not really getting much from the stream. It's way above the stream. So it's just rain falling down and carbon dioxide, and then some nitrogen it would get from a little bit from the sheep, and we get there's some nettles there that do nitrogen fixing, and maybe there's some in rock, I don't know, but it's obviously got enough somehow, and then a little bit later, and this is what it's like today, that's 9 years later, and it's really getting quite thick, and I've done absolutely nothing there. So this little bit outside my front door, a tiny amount of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere has actually been sequestered there and taken out of the atmosphere. So my tiny little bit of removing a tiny smidgen of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so you can do that with soils. If you manage your soil properly, you can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, just like happens just outside the front of my house. And the good agricultural practices, we can turn that around. United Kingdom especially, and our trees and our peat bogs and our meadows, the carbon dioxide is increasing, the carbon content is increasing. So there's no real reason why our soils can't do that too. It's just that they aren't very well managed. What they do is that they put lots of fertilizer in, and then they take lots of crops out, and there's nothing much going back in. Even the crop wastes, they cart the crops off to supermarkets, and the waste gets separated in the supermarket or on the way there rather than on the farm, some of the waste. So the various things you can do to turn that around and to help start getting the organics going back into the soil again. And that's the way to get better soil health in the United Kingdom, including, for instance, cover crops in winter. Because if you leave the soil bare over winter, and then if instead you cover it with a crop that just does nothing except cover the soil, and then at the end you dig it in. For instance, my parents used to grow comfrey in their garden over winter, in the bits where they're going to be growing vegetables in the summer, and comfrey is quite a good cover crop, which you can then dig into the soil, and it adds organics to the soil. In the United Kingdom, then our allotments have much better soil health than the agricultural land, because people look after the soil properly, and they return a lot of the organics to the soil, and they might take kitchen waste out of the soil and things like that. Now, this is a very dramatic example of showing how fast soil can grow. This is roughly, with my house it's 9 years. The difference between this is not Photoshop, this is what it used to be like, this is what it is. That was in 2005, it's continued since then. It's getting more wooded and more covered in stuff, in grassland. This was an area of China that used to be very good soil in the distant past, many centuries ago. And it's gradually got degraded, and mainly through overgrazing. There are many areas, dry areas around the world, that are bad soil because of overgrazing. And that's the only reason. So they just turned that around. They took mainly they fenced it off and stopped animals getting in there. They did some other things as well, and then this was the result. It didn't take any fertilizing and stuff like that. It's very much like my garden. It just created better conditions, mainly stopped the grazing pressure and turned that into that. And then now it's like this, you can have the animals go back in, but do it in a proper fashion. And this is now a big food basket for China. They produce lots of crops that they export to the rest of China. So from this, where nobody could grow anything, to this, where it's exporting food to the rest of China, in just 14 years. So the idea that you get these people, they just despair, they think, well, the whole of civilization is going to collapse. And this is one of the reasons why they think it's going to collapse, because if you have no topsoil, then how are you going to have a civilization going on topsoil so they reason. But it's not happening, the opposite is happening. Now there is still serious soil degradation, but we have many projects like that which are going the other way. There's some techie details here, I may go rather quickly, but the soil erosion is quite common around the world, but it's important to realise that not all soil erosion is bad. This soil erosion, for instance, in the Himalayas, is what makes India fertile, makes Bangladesh fertile. And the soil erosion in parts of Africa lead to the Nile Delta being so fertile, which is what led to the early Egyptian civilization. And tropical soils are naturally rather poor and cooler soils and are richer in biomass. In tropical soils, the trees don't need to have a lot of organics in the soil, they take it out of the atmosphere very easily. And there's a big variation here. You have the carbon dioxide in this carbon content in the soil is very low, it's very thin soil. So you look at the tropical jungle and it looks so rich and lush and full of stuff. What you don't realise is most of that is above the ground. And it's not very rich below the ground. At least most of the tropical rainforest will come to an important exception later. If you look at the colder places, you have huge amounts of carbon in the soil. And this is just a rough idea about places where it's very difficult to measure, where it's not just natural erosion, but it's actual land change, where the soil carbon content is changing. This is giving you an example, trying to move the blue areas where it's growing. And another thing many people don't realise, that foliage is increasing around the world. Even in South America, even with the deforestation and everything, but the foliage overall is increasing. Very few areas which are actually decreasing. And this is partly because this is greening is seen from space. And this is partly because of the carbon dioxide fertilization effect. And if you look, it's very striking though, in China, there's a lot of greening because of deforestation. Well, let's look at this map, this thing down here. This is the greening where you look at the greening due to human activity. And in China, there's a huge amount of greening because of the deforestation, like the project I showed you, and the reversing defect certification. But when it comes to India, there's also a huge amount of greening. In that case, it's because through intensive cultivation of food. You also have that in China as well. It's also a factor in China, but it's the main factor in India. For instance, in India, they used to have only one harvest a year, now in many parts. Now they have special varieties of rice that can reach harvest by the end of the rainy season, then with enough time to sow lentils, or other drier crops, which then grow through the dry season. So with and they have drip-fed irrigation, which makes it easier to irrigate in drier conditions. So India is hugely greening because of that. And if you ever feel down and depressed because of what you've read on the internet, I recommend doing a bit of positive framing of yourself. So look at the positive things that are happening in the world. And this is not this is an entirely legitimate thing to do. And some people, I can guarantee that some people watching this will, when they started the video, they may well have thought that the next generation, even their own children, they may worry that they're not going to grow up to adulthood. And so hopefully you're beginning, if you're in that situation, if this is the first video you've seen, and it might well be that it isn't saying that, then hopefully this helps turn around this positive feeling and just having a moment of optimism. And this is good, this is positive. This leads people to making more action, not less, on climate change. Because they begin to see there's some hope. There's lots of hope. And this is an example, and a small group of people, sometimes just one person, can make a huge difference. This is a little area in a desert, and then desert in a habitation, village, town kind of thing. And then this is what that was in 2009, 2010, 2011, and look, just was that 3 years later, and they have little forests growing there. The people are doing things like that around the world in lots of places. Actually, we'll come to this in a minute. Most of we've got the Great Green Wall that's coming here, and I was very pleased to see recently that there's as a result of the need for big incentives to recover from the recession, there's a big funding, $10 billion or something, into restarting the Great Green Wall project, a very good project that sadly faltered because of lack of funding. And that's the big problem in Africa, is funding for these things. Levels of funding that you could easily find. United Kingdom could find $10 billion easily, just maybe it's building a few roads or something. But for Africa, for the entire sub-Saharan area, they've had really big problems finding $10–20 billion for this really excellent project, which will cause a huge amount of greening in the sub-Saharan Africa. And the Sahara itself is very fertile, potentially, because as recently as 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was covered in grassland. Not many people know that. And it's due to a cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, it's called, the cycle of the direction the Earth's axis goes and how that interacts with the seasons. And whether the southern hemisphere is closest when the Earth's closest to the sun, or the northern hemisphere is closest. And this changes, and gradual changes, and the green area in the Sahara Desert ended 5,000 years ago during the time of the early Egyptians, I think that is. And this was all grassland. And I'll show you an image down there, and I'll come back up and show some of this stuff. So here is, these are petroglyphs, these are actual drawings on rocks by the ancient people from the Sahara Desert, just 5,000 years ago, and they drew giraffes, elephants, aurochs, that's a kind of primitive cattle, hippos and antelopes, and those all were running and jumping around on the, and hippos need water, and they were all in the Sahara Desert just 5,000 years ago. So there's actually huge potential in the Sahara to do much the same as what China did. But I mean, along the southern Saharan region here, you can do a lot of that. And Ethiopia has had a really big tree planting season time recently. This is an example of how, this is from Saudi Arabia, and you think Saudi Arabia desert, and that's what it used to be like. But this is what it used to be like long ago, and you look at that, I mean, if this was in the United Kingdom, we think, oh, what a dry place, not much agriculture there. But if you look at it with the eye of someone who lives in Saudi Arabia, that's a very fertile area. They have their animals, they can go up, they can go grazing, they have trees where they can have some crops, they've got quite a low population, and so this is a fertile region for them. And there's a very large area that they actually made like that. You can see all these, they made these, just mostly those rocks moving by hand. They made these barriers, really very simple techniques. But it's because the floods, very rarely, it's only floods, sometimes you have years go by without any rain. And then you have a few inches of rain, big catchment area, floods all the way down to the river, and it causes problems, it damages houses, and cars get flooded and so on. And so these things are both, and then it just goes into the sea, it does no good to anyone. So this is slowing down the water, so it sinks into the land, and then you get this sort of thing happening. So there's wonderful projects like that going on. That's the Chinese project where he showed us a video about it. I strongly recommend that video. And these are the projects like that, before and after photographs. You can see the before that. This is in Australia. Same sort of thing is happening in Australia. There are people there who are saying, well, look, we've got to stop. There are areas of Australia which are getting worse. There are other areas where people are saying, we've got to turn this around, we've got to make the soil better. And this is one such project where dry areas have turned into this, grass and marshes and so on. So this is happening everywhere around the world, loads and loads of projects like that. And this is another example. I told you the Sahara Desert is very fertile potentially. Well, this is the idea of a saltwater greenhouse. And many areas in deserts are really quite low-lying. Some areas are even below the sea. And the idea of the saltwater greenhouse is that you take salt water from the sea, rather than pump it, or it might even go downhill in some areas of the desert which are below the sea. But you don't just pour salt water on the desert. That would be horrible and really not a good idea unless you want a salty sea. Instead, what you do is you put it through a kind of radiator thing, and the desert sun heat that evaporates the water, leaving behind salt behind, just like a salt pan, as you have near the sea quite often. So it's like a kind of salt pan, but the water vapor, you capture the water vapor from the salt pan. That's basically the idea. So you end up with salt, which is a great benefit. Usually something you can sell and do things with. And then you have the water vapor, but the water vapor evaporates inside the greenhouse. And then you have the wind. You have the wind from the desert, very dry wind, blows the controlled way. You have vents. You let it through the greenhouse, then it goes up the other side. And this brings moisture to all the plants in the greenhouse. And this is just like my house. It didn't do any irrigation, any fertilizer, nothing. It would start off like that, and just because of the air going through the greenhouse, it ends up like that. So the saltwater greenhouses actually bring water back to the desert. They replenish the aquifer. Most agriculture in deserts uses up the aquifers and dries them up. This replenishes them and makes them deeper, adds more water to the desert. And this is more screening in the Qatar Peninsula using these same saltwater greenhouses. So we can potentially actually return areas of the Sahara Desert to greenery like that using these greenhouses. It's actually possible if we had a very high level of temperature, but hopefully we don't go that far. But at quite high scenarios, the Sahara might just possibly go green naturally because the warmer climate has more moisture in it. But hopefully we don't go that far, but we can actually spread agriculture into the desert. And there's the Sahara Forest Project, which is basically based on these things like these saltwater greenhouses and planting trees in the Sahara Desert, like artificial oases, which we could have throughout the Sahara Desert. Because the Sahara Desert, it just needs water. You look at the oasis. Oasis is trees, there's palm trees, vegetation. If you get the water there, then you can start having fertile land. And if you have lots of projects like that, then there's a great deal of potential. Now, let's look at the forests throughout the world. Most people, again, think that the entire world is deforesting. That's not true at all. This is where it's being a lot of reforestation going on. And as you can see, China has a lot of it. But most people don't realize Russia, Northern Europe, they have a lot. And even Brazil, there's a lot of reforestation going on in Brazil. It's mainly along the Atlantic coast. I think we just show a single colour for the entire country. Some big forests, dry forests, not a tropical rain forest, along the Atlantic coast, where there's a lot of reforestation happens in Brazil. There's also some reforestation of the tropical rainforest. So it's not just being cut down, some of it is being reforested. And this can actually turn around. Anyway, I've got a separate video to talk about that to do, but all the other countries, apart from South America, then is actually reforesting. Africa is just about in balance, the same amount afforest as deforest. And but it's not got anything like the deforestation level of South America, which has sadly is reduced the amount of forest. But something to bear in mind that the United Kingdom used to be covered in trees, and most of it's gone, but we're now going back again. And for the last few decades, the United Kingdom, and it was quite interesting in a way, but almost amusing for someone who's followed this for some time, that at the last election, suddenly, 2019, the United Kingdom seems to have woken up to the need to grow forests. I mean, people have been saying that for ages, but in 2019, suddenly, because of the 2018 report and the Extinction Rebellion and all that, and we had all the major parties in the United Kingdom vying with each other as to who could promise to plant the most trees per year in the United Kingdom. The Labour Party, I think, was one of the highest, maybe the Green was highest of all, but the Conservatives, they had to do that as well. Well, they just it was probably seriously dent on their chances of coming in, being elected. Actually, they were the one that won, and I think people, the general, I don't know if it's true, but the general feeling was that theirs was the most credible, even though it was less than the offering from the Labour Party. I don't want to get involved in the politics of all that, but it was rather amusing the way that we had all the parties vying to promise to reforest faster in the United Kingdom and promising more renewable energy. And I think this is going to happen in the United States. It didn't happen in the last election, but by 2024, 2028, you're going to have this, I think, both parties vying with each other on their green credentials. And you might have the Republicans like Conservatives saying, well, I know our number is less than the Democrats, but we're really going to do it. Things like that. I think that might be the kind of dialogue by 2028. Anyway, we'll see. Because of the young people growing up there who really care about climate change, no matter what your political background. I'm not sure if that's Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a very big greening project. And so there's a huge amount going on. Now, yes, another thing, so this is about United Kingdom, particularly, but it's also we'll get to how it's relevant to other countries as well. And it is relevant. The very ingenious idea is to use crushed basalt. And if you crush basalt and you crush it up little bits, then it becomes rather chemically reactive, and it'll take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so this is, if you crush up your basalt, not just gather up basalt, but you crush it, and then you put it into the soil. And this is rather like using lime to improve the soil, but it also improves the organics as well. And it's a new idea as to how to improve soils. And this kind of leads naturally on to many people don't realize that you could actually grow a good topsoil on the moon and have good crops on the moon. I have a particular interest in this. I wrote an article called An Astronaut Gardener on the Moon, which is sometimes called Complete with L-E-A-T. That's a complete guide to gardening. It's a classic of English literature, I think it is. I think it's English. Anyway, they call it the complete guide to lunar gardening. They called my article that. I just kind of amusing some of the shares of it, some of the copies of it. But anyway, they changed the title and then linked to my article. Anyway, it's called The Astronaut Garden on the Moon. And it's not my own work, it's not primary research. It's talking about the various ways that experts have said that we can grow crops on the moon. The lunar soil is quite like basalt, and basalt has all the basic ingredients you need to grow a crop. Now, originally, they probably used aeroponics, and maybe some soil as well. The Russians, this is a video, a still from the Russian video, that's a complete video, and they have been especially keen on this, especially during the Cold War. The Russians were very keen on lunar agriculture, and they actually developed a method of growing crops. It's very efficient. It's by far probably the most efficient way of growing crops that's ever been developed. And there are other ones now in the United States and in China. They're doing the same sort of thing. I think Russia were first in on this game. And the idea nowadays, back then I think they did too. You use aeroponics, where you don't need soil. So this really shows how you don't need soil. How you can get the organics. How all that greenery actually comes from the air and water, and a very, very tiny amount of trace elements. Because you can actually grow even trees, plants, crops, standard crops. You can grow them in water, in air, just in moist air. The root's not actually in soil. But you've got to add the necessary ingredients they need, next minerals and so on, to the water, so they get those through their roots. And that's called aeroponics. And that's probably how you get started in lunar agriculture, because obviously there isn't going to be much soil to start with. And but they have developed incredibly efficient ways of doing agriculture. So I talked about how India has 2 crops a year in many parts, in the monsoon season and the rest of the year. Well, with the methods devised for lunar agriculture, now remember, they temperature control the entire inside, the humidity, the temperature, everything can be made absolutely optimal because it's all enclosed. And they achieve, and then they use crops that are the very best crops that crop very quickly, or wheat that can crop in optimal conditions in 30 days. So they can achieve 12 harvests a year with lunar agriculture. It's really quite amazing. And then another thing, not many people realise, but I mean, they have a closed system there. The way that it would work on the moon is that when you eat food, many people don't realise, they sort of think, oh, most of the organics in the food ends up as your feces, but that doesn't make sense. Because after all, you are using the carbon in the food in order to get energy back, and you turn it into carbon dioxide. And it turns out that most of the food you eat turns into gas, and you breathe it out, or into water and goes out your urine. But with carbon, most of the carbon you eat leaves your lungs as carbon dioxide. And then, if you are in a habitat on the moon, then the greenery will take up that carbon dioxide, and it will combine with water, and it produces oxygen as a byproduct. And then that is how the astronauts breathe. And so you have a complete enclosed circle system, and if they are importing more food than they need, they'll have too much carbon dioxide. So they have a problem with too much carbon dioxide in these habitats. And then over a period of time, then they would be able to gradually add the carbon to the lunar basalt, and they'll end up having a topsoil on the moon. And they can't necessarily, there's actually methane at lunar poles, and there's carbon dioxide at lunar poles, and there's ammonia, we don't know how much, but there's some of all of that. So you could actually use that without any imports from Earth, theoretically. Then you could make quite a large area of lunar surface into soil just using those imports, and then gradually human green beings would spread out in that way and to parts of the moon. Anyway, I don't want to go into agriculture particularly. That's an interest in my I could go and talk for now about that, and now about that several hours probably, but that's not the topic here. So, but the Earth is never going to become like the moon, but this shows the huge potential we have on the Earth. For when you look at it and you think, when people are worrying, how are we going to feed everyone? Well, remember that the experts, the enthusiasts on space settlement think that they will be able to spread out over the moon and eventually make everything in situ. So if we use the same method on Earth, you don't need clumsy spacesuits to go out and repair your habitat, and you don't need to cover it with several meters of radiation shielding, and you don't need to hold it in under 10 tons of upward pressure of the atmosphere. So we have it much, much easier here. Any desert on Earth would be a far easier place to live than the moon. And we could grow, instead of having, we could have like one person every 30 square meters. With that's just 6 meters by 5 meters. If you use that super efficient way of agriculture, that's enough to grow all the food, nearly all the food, not everything, that one person needs, from 6 meters by 5 meters. And just one person could live off that. And so we look at how we suddenly be able to grow enough food forever. We don't need to do this. Instead, what we need to do is we just need to make Africa is the main thing. It's really quite a bit larger than India or China, and it's got the same population. And reversing certification, yes, at the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, and then improving the agriculture, because it is very, very poor agriculture, very low yields in Africa. The thing is that they just haven't had the funding, they haven't had the input there, they don't have the schools, education. You know, many places, like even today, many schools in Africa can't connect to the internet and don't have electricity, and they don't have water for washing your hands. You just don't have the most basic communities. So Africa, the main reason the population is growing so fast in Africa is because they have very low, quite a low standard of living. We find that all countries with a high standard of living, and then the population levels off and it starts falling. That's a universal thing for all religions, all ideologies, all government systems. Then that happens. And so at some point that's happening in Africa because it is improving, their conditions are improving hugely. And the big question into how high a population goes is how quickly does Africa become prosperous. And if it becomes prosperous quickly, then they won't have many more. If that is delayed quite a bit, it'll quadruple to 4 billion people there by the year 2100, because they're not so prosperous, and then eventually they'll level out. And either way, Africa can grow even at 4 billion people. It's got several times the land area of India and China. We can still feed everyone in the world with 4 billion people in Africa. So we are going to have plenty of food. I think I've talked separately about how we have, yes, better say a little bit about it here. So many of you may think, if you haven't seen the other debunks and so on, that at the end of every year, many of you may well worry that at the end of every year that we we only just barely manage to make enough food to get through to the end of the year, because you hear about hunger around the world and malnourishment, and many people about children being stunted because they're not eating enough and so on. And natural to think, oh, surely that means we're only barely producing enough food, but that's so far from the truth. We have a huge excess of food at the end of every year for the world. And in just the last 10 years, that excess has increased by 30%, while the population has increased by only 10%. So the excess is increasing every year. And that excess is so big that I did a bit of a calculation. It's 800 million tons of grain, and using 2,700 calories as enough to easy enough to feed someone so that they're no longer starving, no longer malnourished, then that is enough to feed 2.6 billion people for an entire year. And that's how much excess food we will have at the end of this year. So that's enough to end hunger. We could have reached zero hunger if we could find a way to distribute that food equitably. And that's enough food to deal with the malnourishment for years into the future, just from our excess for this year. So it's food inequity and distribution is the problem. The United Nations has this as one of their objectives for 2030 to end zero hunger, to end malnourishment around the world. There's no technical, there's no scientific reason why we can't do that. It's entirely political and to do with and economics and these sorts of things. That's the only reason that we still have people and young children who grow up stunted because in places like Africa because they didn't get enough to eat and things like that. So now, just going to end with how with soil improvement, I talked about how in the United Kingdom and in Europe we have these plug-in soils. There's another one like that in the Amazon, in the rainforest. The Mayans had a very similar kind of approach, but they instead cut down trees and they made them into charcoal, like the old charcoal burners. We used to have the travelling folk in the United Kingdom. They used to make charcoal. They used to go into the woods and cut down trees, make them into charcoal. They did the same in the Amazon long before my time. That's back to like 19th century, I think. But in the Amazon, then many people don't realise. So there's all this thing about how we're cutting down so much of the tropical rainforest. That is sad, and there's a lot of richness and diversity there. But actually, quite a few of the areas we're chopping down were chopped down long ago by the Mayans. So the more distant parts up in the uplands and the wetter parts, they were never chopped down. And they've been there for hundreds of thousands of years. But the very wide flat areas around the Amazon River, they were cut down by the Mayans. And they replaced them by very rich agricultural land. So remember I talked about how in the tropics the soil is very thin. So they made the soil much thicker by using, making charcoal. They turned the wood into charcoal, they burnt it, but producing very little carbon dioxide, instead turning it all directly into charcoal. And then they buried that into the ground, which made a very rich soil. So they could do agriculture, even though the soil, and nowadays we have them cutting down the rainforest trees. Now the soil they get, it's grassland for cattle, but it's not the most excellent soil. And this was a way to make it really good soil. It depends which bit. I mean, if you cut down one of these, there's excellent soil underneath because the ancient Mayans made it excellent. But if you cut down a bit of the rainforest that hasn't had this treatment, then it's not necessarily going to be good soil underneath. So this is the way to do that. And we can actually, of course, with the Amazon, we need to try and restore the rainforest, better regenerative agriculture for the soils that they have there, for the agricultural land they have, that can sequester soil, carbon dioxide into soils as well. So the agriculture in Brazil can also absorb carbon dioxide. It's not just reforestation. The agriculture, if you can improve the soils, can also absorb carbon dioxide if you do it properly. And so then we have the idea of a technosoil. So yeah, talk about, I haven't talked about this bit, let's go back to it. Right, so I talked about how we can sequester soil into the carbon dioxide into the soil. Many people again don't realise how much you can do that way. So some example trials, this is 3.5 tons per hectare, and this is another one about 3 tons per hectare in demonstration. This is going on for year after year after year. This one has sequestered 3 tons per hectare every year for 30 years. And this is another one that is doing it at 8 tons per hectare, and it's a special composting system. And that would be 40 tons, 40 gigatons if you could manage to improve all the soils that are suitable for it worldwide. You could take, that's pretty much our actual carbon dioxide we produce from fossil fuels. Now people look at that and they say, no, there's no way we can do that. And they say, all the farmers are so conservative, they're not going to want to change. And there's some truth to that, but the reason that poor farmers are so conservative is because they don't have any funding. They can't take on the debts. They have no access to debt. They can't take out a loan. And even if they could take out a loan, they'd be very scared about not paying it back. Because if something goes wrong, have a bad harvest or something, that's their farm gone. So that's the reason why they're so conservative, is because it's difficult for them to access funding. And there are initiatives underway to improve the funding of the poor farmers in various parts of the world, to enable them to be more adventurous and experimental and doing things that they know would work. Like, for instance, in Brazil, then many farmers would like to reseed the grassland, which is a standard thing that farmers do in the United States, but they can't afford to do them in Brazil. And as a result, the grass is very poor, so they have to cut down more forest in order to keep the same number of cows. And a lot of the deforestation in Brazil would end if all the farmers had the funding to reseed their grassland. If they were able to have their grassland as good as the grassland in the United States, which takes a few years to get it underway, then they would be able to produce the same amount for much less. And this is actually happening, but it's happening much slower. If there was the funding, it could be much faster. I mean, look, like with the Great Green Wall in Africa, and you know how that $20 billion would not be a huge amount for the United States, but that project was just stuck doing nothing for years, because the whole of sub-Saharan Africa and the region up there, the Sahara and so on, all those countries, they just couldn't access. They couldn't get hold of that amount of money to continue with the project. It just wasn't available. So if we can be more of funding of these projects in weak economies, we can help the entire world. We can improve the food situation throughout the world. We can sequester more carbon dioxide, improve the soils, reverse desertification. So there's a huge amount that we can do to improve this and make things better. And the actual amount of carbon dioxide you could potentially sequester from the soil is really quite huge. How much this could be extended, as much as 3 tons per hectare throughout the world per year. But certainly, we could do an awful lot more than we're doing now. And so, anyway, hopefully this turns us around. You're a little bit more positive about this. I could go on and on. There's many things that I haven't mentioned yet. Do go and have a look at my debunk. There are links to many others, and I can go and talk about some of these others some other time. And I strongly recommend, if you're scared, do join our group, Facebook Debunk. Do like and subscribe this channel. If you are good at debunking, then again, you're very welcome to the group, especially expertise doesn't necessarily mean you're an academic, but that you've know stuff like you've had a special interest, and you know how to check your sources properly. And it of course also what counts as a reliable source is not always the academic. It depends on what topic you are looking at. And so, for instance, if you live in in some cases knowing about the politics versus knowing about but anyway, there are many different areas, and sometimes it's about theology for some of the scared people in our group, and then there's medicine, and there are many, like with the many people scared of the COVID pandemic and so on. And also, if you're good at reassuring very scared people, and also if you're very good at working with autistic people, knowing how to talk to autistic, because the people who get most scared by these scenarios and stories, and these fake stories, are autistic. It's very high prevalence. According to one study, we just did one informal poll, and it was about 1 in 4. I think it's probably running at that much or maybe more. The people who get most scared, often they are autistic, and not always. Also, some others it's because they're very imaginative, and then there are others as well, and some because they're bipolar and manic, that makes you very vulnerable to these kind of stories. And what I'm doing here, and just for everyone really, if you get scared by these stories, this is doing no good to anyone. And please, if any activists listen to these videos, just give a little bit of thought to other people who are not activists. And for most people, then in order to become positive and actually start really getting engaged with action on climate change, then you need to know that it's hopeful, that it's positive. If you go and tell them, the civilization incorrectly and falsely, if you go around falsely telling people that civilization is going to collapse, that we're not going to have any topsoil, that all the fish in the sea are going to be gone, and we're going to that, and various other things like that, birds are all going to be gone and so on. These are false beliefs. I can challenge them all, because they're all wrong. And if you start telling them things like that, then most people, that is not going to engage them into action on climate change. So please try to turn it around and be more positive framing and talking, and not tell false things, and try and fact check the things that you say, and try to be more truthful. You may get fewer headlines, and you may get a little bit less publicity, but I think you will get much more action and much more actual concrete things done on the ground if you start talking a little bit more that way. And you get less opposition, because especially if you say these very exaggerated things, you get a reaction from other people that say, but that's not true, and they are correct, because what you said was false. So making false exaggerations leads to other people correctly saying you're wrong, and then that leads to a polarization and people arguing away against each other, and what gets lost in all that is the climate action, which is what you actually wanted to happen. So anyway, that's enough. I'll stop, and hopefully I managed to record this. So Jessica got a problem last time. Let's hope that it did record the whole thing.